Good morning, colleagues. The delay, we just had a sound issue with one of our witnesses, and we wanted to make sure we had that resolved. And considering everybody was rolling in a little bit late anyway, it worked out perfect.
Hey, Warren and I were here early.
I was here. I did not mention names, but apparently we're going to name and shame, but I'm not going to do that. So, colleagues, we just have the two witnesses today, so we should get 3 rounds in. But if you run out of questions, we'll deal with that when the time comes. And then the second hour, we have some committee business to address that may or may not take the full hour. That depends on us. So, colleagues, I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 114 of the House of Commons Standing Agriculture Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. Today's meeting is taking place in the hybrid format. These proceedings are available on the House of Commons website. Just so our witnesses are aware, the webcast will show the person speaking, not the whole committee. And to our witnesses, again, screenshots are not permitted, so please refrain from doing so. Colleagues, you know all the rules with the headsets for interpretation. Just keep those away from the microphone. For our witnesses, thank you for coming and being here with us today. You may speak in the official language of your choice. We do have interpretation services available. If we do have a sound issue, I will just put my hand up and ask you to pause, and we'll try and get that resolved. But I'm hoping that we can move on fairly easily for the rest of the day now that our sound issues have been resolved. So I'd like to introduce our witnesses here we have with us today on our study on the impact of border carbon adjustments and reciprocities. We have from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Monica Tathova, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, Senior Economist, Markets and Trade Division, Social and Economic Development Workstream. And from the University of Saskatchewan, we have Angela Bedard-Hahn, Dean Professor at the College of Agriculture and Bioresources. You will each have 5 minutes for an opening statement. When you have about 30 seconds left, I'll put my hand up just so you know that your time is running out. But if you're a little bit over, no panic. We've got plenty of time for you today. So perhaps I will start with Ms. Tathova. If you want to go ahead for your 5 minutes, the time is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Bonjour. I will be a little bit longer than 5 minutes, but since there are only 2 witnesses, I hope it's going to be okay. So, je m'appelle Monica Tathova, je suis économiste principale à la division des marchés et du commerce de la FAO.
Ms. Tathova, sorry, do you mind just raising your boom a little bit towards your... There you go. Thank you. Go ahead.
Is it okay now? Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, you're all good. Thanks. Go ahead.
All right.
Good morning. The UN Organization for Food and Agriculture is the specialized agency of the United Nations, which deploys international efforts towards eliminating hunger and malnutrition.
FAO does not prescribe policy choices for countries. Rather, it provides an inventory of evidence-based policy options and their related trade-offs and impacts. Coming from a technical specialized agency, I will focus my remarks on the impacts of border carbon adjustments and reciprocity of standards on food and agriculture. Climate change is a truly global environmental negative externality. Its impacts are indivisibly spread around the entire planet. It affects many economic activities, including agri-food systems, which are responsible for 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Its potential costs are not accounted for by markets, and the benefits from mitigating its impact cannot be divided and claimed by what country. Several policy incentives can help improve emissions efficiency and lower greenhouse gas emissions per unit of outputs. In my statement, as I discuss different policy instruments, I am not referring to any specific country. Carbon taxes or other such instruments, such as emission trading systems, directly tackle the failure of the market to take the social costs of climate change into account. However, at the same time, and unilateral action to impose a carbon tax on food imports may put the country implementing it at a competitive disadvantage on the global markets. A carbon tax might result in a carbon leakage, which is the displacement of lower carbon footprint domestically produced food by cheaper and higher carbon footprint imports from countries that do not take similar measures to reduce emissions. This could result in income losses for domestic producers and an increase in the emissions globally. This is why global negative externalities such as climate change require global solutions. Trade can expand the reach of climate change mitigation policies. There has been considerable interest in the potential use of border tax adjustments that could be based on the carbon footprint. Adjusting for the carbon tax means that the same rate applying to the carbon footprint of domestic products would be applied to imports. In this case, low-emitting suppliers would face a low tax and would be able to compete with domestic products, while high-emitting suppliers would face a higher tax, which would make them less competitive. In this way, trade will be shaped not only by comparative advantage, but also by the relative emissions efficiency. A major technical challenge in determining and applying this border tax adjustment is to calculate the carbon footprint of domestic products and import and apply an appropriate tax on domestic products and corresponding tax adjustments on imports in order to level the playing field. When an explicit carbon tax is applied on domestic products, it would seem relatively straightforward to apply a corresponding border tax adjustment on imports, provided that the carbon footprint, that is, emissions generated in producing and supplying the imports, can be determined. Problems arise in calculating these border tax adjustments when import suppliers have internalized emission costs, or if the tax applied in the exporting country exceeds that applied by the importer, a case in which a tax rebate on imports would be made. In this case, it would be necessary to determine the per unit carbon tax equivalent of these measures. The design and implementation of a carbon tax on food and agricultural products would save several challenges. There would be a need to agree on the carbon accounting mechanisms and on a carbon footprint for all food and agricultural products produced worldwide. There would also be a need to agree on a price of carbon to be able to set the tax and avoid international trade disputes. Any approach to border tax adjustments presents the dual challenge of determining the carbon footprint in both domestic and imported products while ensuring compliance with the rules of the international trading systems. In closing, reducing greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture requires several actions across sectors, including the application not only of mitigation practices, but also of adaptation practices to climate-smart agriculture and policies. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to comment on this topic and for your patience of allowing me a little bit more time. I welcome questions from the committee.
Thank you very much for your expert analysis on this. And now we will turn to Ms. Bedard Hahn from the University of Saskatchewan.
Great. Well, good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone around the table there. I speak to you today from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional homeland of the Métis and the center of the Canadian prairies. I grew up on a mixed farm in north central Saskatchewan, and I did my first 2 degrees here at the University of Saskatchewan. Returning before moving to California for my PhD, I returned to USask as a professor of soil science in 2006. And since 2020, I have been serving as the Dean of the College of Agriculture and Bioresources. In opening, the prospect of border carbon adjustments in agriculture and food does seem to be relatively far off, which is a good thing. because I would argue we, and in this sense, I'm using the global we, Canada included, we're not ready in this space. And I do think we need to tread very carefully because we are potentially messing with global food security in a time when political unrest and protectionism are adding uncertainty to an already very complex global market. Following on Ms. Titova's testimony, I think one of the first things this group needs to be thinking about is remembering why border carbon adjustments are supposedly being developed. And a lot of that underlying idea is to incentivize good behavior that will further reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, or at a minimum, to put in place pricing mechanisms that require high emitters to pay. And this is good in theory, but do we know at this point if these levers will actually work when it comes to food, when it comes to a basic human necessity? And in short, I would argue, not yet. One of our senior researchers from the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics, Dr. Richard Gray, is currently in Uppsala. He's working on an economic model of the world vegetable market to determine whether border carbon adjustment policies are effective or ineffective in preventing higher prices and global deforestation. Those results are in progress and should be out early next year in 2025. He's also looking at the potential effect of full net ecosystem exchange on carbon accounting, both domestic and globally. And what this means is accounting that takes into consideration the carbon that is actually sequestered in some of these commodities that we produce, the carbon that is sequestered in grains, pulses, and oilseeds, which is subsequently exported and consumed elsewhere, which is currently not incorporated. I would argue that before we go too far down the border carbon adjustment path, we need to make sure we have data, all the data we need from exports like Dr. Gray and others that are looking at the net effects of border carbon adjustment on various markets and on various countries before heading down this path. Now, even without the socioeconomic analyses yet in hand, there are other pieces that we need to take care of here at home before moving forward with border carbon adjustment in agriculture and food. As this committee has heard previously from Dr. Steve Webb and others, we do have data that supports Canadian agriculture as a world leader in terms of our low carbon intensity in the production of crops such as canola, wheat, peas, and lentils. And perhaps this is a reason that we should be embracing the notion of border carbon adjustment, because with Canada's relatively strong track record for sustainable production, we should, in theory, be net beneficiaries of such a policy. But if we do implement border carbon adjustment, we also need to be sure that Canada first recognizes the value of our own practices so that any export rebates are appropriate, that our products are not subjected to unjust import targets in other countries because we are not giving adequate credit to producers and systems where credit is due. So if we don't appropriately value our own sustainability practices, why would we expect other countries to do so? To do this, to get where we need to go, we do need to implement an appropriate MRV measurement reporting and verification framework to ensure that credit flows where credit is due. And as Ms. Titova was speaking, I was thinking about the variability, not just certainly around the world, a huge variability when we think about trying to develop a carbon footprint for different agricultural commodities, but just thinking about the variability across Canada, or even the variability within individual provinces. Many farmers are indeed already doing incredible work in sustainability, while others still have room for improvement. If we move towards border carbon adjustment, how do we leverage any import charges to reward sustainable practices? And equally important, how do we ensure that farmers who have been farming sustainably for years, those early adopters, that they reap the benefits of something like the border carbon adjustment, while still simultaneously encouraging them to be early adopters of new emerging technologies that we're working on? Now, unfortunately, at this point, MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification in agriculture, is very difficult. So coming up with that footprint is very difficult due to a high degree of variability across fields, across regions, over time. This variability is associated with all aspects of measuring carbon intensity in a natural system. This doesn't mean that the challenges are insurmountable, but it does mean that we need to continue investing in the research that will help us overcome these challenges. And we need to invest in the data management frameworks that will allow us to integrate the research and come up with tools that can reduce the risk of measurement and verification error. It's been said to this committee before that the ideal will be a harmonized approach with our major global trading partners. We need to be aligned as best we can to ensure this doesn't take us down a path to even greater trade protectionism. And yes, we of course need to be paying attention to what's happening in the EU, US, Australia on this issue. But at the same time, we do need to get our own house in order and get clarity on how we'll recognize our regional and sub-regional variation in sustainable management practices. And so there are four main focus areas that I think we need to look at. The first, research that empowers our farmers, our producers, to continue improving their sustainability with focus on solutions that are win-win, regardless of carbon pricing, carbon taxing. These are solutions that reduce input costs, enhance yield, and improve soil health. Here in the prairies, this is why we saw a widespread adoption of no-till and conservation tillage. It just made sense from all of those perspectives. The second focus needs to be on developing baseline data sets and harmonized measurement, reporting, and verification protocols that enable regionally appropriate measures of carbon intensity. Third, we need to ensure that carbon taxation and credit schemes are science-based, are evidence-based, and that we understand how border carbon adjustment will affect various sectors within our overarching agriculture and food sector. This includes any risk of additional trade barriers for Canada, given that we are such an export-dependent country and already vulnerable to protectionism and trade tariffs. Finally, I think it's important that we can use our learning to lead a better way forward for global agriculture. From a position of strength, backed by science, we can show other countries how to improve their sustainability. If border carbon adjustment does move into agriculture and food systems, we want to be sure that we are proactive versus reactive. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Ms. Bedard-Hahn. Very good to see you again. Unfortunately, not in person this time, but thank you very much for being here. I was remiss to welcome a few substitutes today. We have Ms. McPherson of the NDP. Thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Epp, one of the Conservatives who are joining us today, and Mr. Morrissey is joining us as well. Thank you very much for coming. We will now move over to the question and answer portion. We'll go to the Conservatives first. Mr. Epp, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'd like to start with two basic questions. And if you want, on a scale of 0 to 10 or 0 to 100, where are we at? Let's start in Canada and then also more internationally. I'll ask both of you to comment. Just on a simple agreement and understanding of what how to measure the carbon footprint. I know in Ontario, I think we produce something like 257 different products, agricultural primary products. Across that spectrum, just on a broad scale, where are we at in understanding what the actual carbon footprint is of each of those? And then secondly, the second question to follow up, where are we at in the level of international agreement if we measure things differently? And again, on a scale, pick your scale, 0 to 10 or 0 to 100, whatever, of just as a baseline to begin to think about international trading systems on carbon border adjustments. Maybe we'll start with Ms. Bedard-Hahn, please.
Great. Well, thank you for that question. With respect to how to measure the footprint, to me, there's two layers to that question. There's the part where we know how to measure it, but the how to measure it in a cost-efficient manner is perhaps the second trickier piece. So there's, in terms of how to measure it, we are aware of the various components that need to go into that calculation when we think about an entire life cycle analysis that should ultimately go into a comprehensive assessment of the carbon intensity of a particular crop. I would argue that we're further along in some of those larger, more dominant commodities, less so in the smaller, more niche ones. But in terms of where the challenge lies is in the pieces that I raised earlier. It's with respect to the variability that is inherent to that. So if I were to use the example of the work that was put out by the Global Institute of Food Security, that was very nicely rolled up at a provincial level, right? And so we could look at the carbon intensity on average across Saskatchewan or across countries based on the typical set of practices. Now, does it matter, I guess? Does it matter whether we've got a producer over here that is implementing those practices and another over here that is not? That's the trickier question to consider if we're actually trying to use this as a mechanism whereby we incentivize different practices.
And I'm going to ask then Ms. Titokova also to comment.
Yes, I would agree with that. We know in theory what we want to include, right? We have the theory on how to proceed, what should be accounted for. In many cases, particularly for, let's say, smaller countries, we might not have all the data available to come up with a comprehensive number. But I would argue that, in fact, it is good that we are having this conversation about the carbon adjustment, about the content of the carbon, about the environmental policies in general, then this is one of the steps that improves framing and thinking about the topic.
To conclude my time, I want to talk pickles, only because it illustrates, I think, the complexity and potentially the administrative nightmare. I live near the U.S., southwestern Ontario. We grow, obviously you don't plant pickles, you plant small cucumbers that are pickled. However, we don't have a pickling industry left in Ontario. So pickles are grown, they're shipped to local green shipping yards where they're sized and then distributed to Ohio, Michigan, New York, pickled, put into jars, then shipped back into Canada into our retail markets. And I'm also aware of in the EU that there's trade, actually in cucurbits, between non-EU Eastern European countries and European countries. So some of the same dynamics would apply in both situations. How would you go about administering a CBAM program on cross-border trade as it goes through the transformation process, where you've got transportation involved along with the initial growing systems? Maybe Ms. Bedard-Dahan to start, and then Ms. Titokova.
Yeah. So that's basically what I was getting at the up front when I mentioned, we're not ready for this. And when I was talking to Dr. Gray about this in advance of this, providing my testimony here today, we were talking about that very complexity, right? The fact that it is such a global marketplace. And, I could give you the exact same example when it comes to lentils. So some of the things that we export out of Saskatchewan, only to have it, processed on the other side of the world and then come back to us in some sort of a value-added product. And so I'm acutely aware of those challenges because when we start putting that in, who covers the cost of, because you incorporated that into the carbon intensity of that end pickle product in the example you're giving, is the transportation to move those cucumbers from Ontario into wherever they're processed, and then again for them to come back. And so, at what point is that applied? Is that adjustment applied? Is it applied twice? And at what point does this no longer actually make sense in terms of the cost of administering such a program relative to the actual benefits of it? And that would ultimately be one of my biggest concerns if part of this is meant to be incentivizing.
Thank you. I want to save a bit of time for Mr. Kova as well. Sorry.
Yeah.
Mr. Toma. So
Sorry.
I will entertain. It's okay. So because I like your example about pickles. I also realized that there is this active pickle trade between Canada and the United States. So, but when we think conceptually, it's a fine example talking about the products that are further processed down the value chain, right? But I would start thinking from the commodities if Canada is shipping lentils from Saskatchewan to somewhere else to being processed, what is the carbon footprint of this shipping? Because ultimately, as you go along all the way to the retail level, there are many steps that are along the way, each of them coming with its separate set of transportation issues, etc., etc. So perhaps it's good to start thinking about the pictures that cuts off. For example, so the pickles go to Michigan and then they are shipped back and we stop right there, right? We are not going to consider additional distribution levels. It is, again, something that is good to start thinking about, but I would urge to start thinking about the commodity shipments before we start talking about the specific products
Thank
at
you.
the consumer level.
Thank you for your time. Now we'll move to Ms. Murray for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much for that very interesting testimony, because I think we all agree that we don't want higher carbon products to have an advantage over those who have invested in lower carbon alternative processes. Canada is not inviting border carbon adjustment, but I have two questions. So what, off the bat, I mean, one is, how do we define, like, what's in the boundaries of what would be counted? And I'm thinking about the the issue of food waste, that in Canada about 32% of food is lost or wasted, which could be redirected to feed people. So that's based on a research project by Value Chain Management International and Second Harvest. So how is food waste accounted for in this, and how can Canada's preparation, should there be a border carbon adjustment, how can that help us incentivize practices that reduce that 30% of food that could be redirected to feed people that's wasted? And in fact, 58% of all food in Canada is lost or wasted. How do we reduce that in how we set up our way of thinking about this? So a thought about that from both of our witnesses, and thank you for your testimony.
I think we were in a bit of a staring match here to see who was going to take that one up first. So I would suggest that, again, this is an area where we are not yet ready. But if we were to think about that from the perspective of how best to apply that, and I'm thinking out loud here, I suspect then we would have different levels that we would need to be thinking about in terms of the relative risk of waste or loss. Some food products are at much greater risk of loss or wastage than others. Some store and transport easier and more readily. Others are much more vulnerable to waste, and that's typically reflected in the value of those in the first place. But that would need to be accounted for in setting this up. It does highlight one of the additional complexities that is unique to the food systems, though, as opposed to other areas where the border carbon adjustments are being contemplated. So that's an excellent point.
Thank you for going first. I will add to it that both food loss and waste, there is a difference. One is up to on the producers' levels, the other one is more on the consumers' level. That would be for a separate hearing. But when we talk about the food loss and waste, the issue is part of what we cover under agro-food systems transformation, right? It is important by lowering the amount of food loss and waste, we are improving the availability. As you mentioned, we are improving the availability of food for additional processing, for consumers, etc., etc. It is the cross-border adjustments and the policies that are accounting for the externalities are also part of the food systems transformation, but they come from a slightly different angle. But the goal of both of them is to improve the functioning and the efficiency of the agri-food systems. Omar.
I think this is a question that's been asked to all of our witnesses, and that is what, I'll just frame it as, what are the top 3 things that Canada could and should do to be as prepared as possible should border carbon adjustments come into play internationally?
So I can speak to that first. As highlighted in my testimony, I think getting at some of these key questions is going to be essential. And the way to get at that first is continuing to look at the research that allows us to continue to advance our sustainability practices and at every level of the value chain. So in my testimony, I emphasize the importance of practices for farmers, but as was highlighted with the earlier question, this needs to be looked at all the way through the value chain, the win-win practices that allow us to enhance our sustainability with or without the border carbon adjustment, so that we're coming from a position of strength. Second, making sure we've got the data that we need to actually participate in this, that we have the footprinting that Ms. Titova was referring to, that we have the data sets and a data framework that allow us to keep track of that information. And finally, that we're really focusing on, that we have that understanding of the potential effects of such policies all the way through our systems, that we're not taken aback when we get to a different stage in our food production systems and say, oh, well, we didn't quite see that one coming, did we? Whether it's at the producer level or at the grocery level. So those would be the 3 areas that I think we need to make sure that we are looking at carefully in advance of implementing anything in Canada.
Yeah, Ms.
Now I
Titova.
unmuted myself. Yes.
If you can just, in about 30 seconds, if you don't mind, please. Thank you.
Yes, I would just add one point to it, and that's to strive to discuss this issue in the context of global institutions, right? Because you don't want to be part of a discussion when one country sets up a certain system and then another country needs to fit into it. It's a global externality, and as I mentioned in my testimony, a global externality requires global solution. So need to discuss about common methodologies on how to arrive there, and then once there is a common understanding, it will be easier to arrive to solutions that will fit more people or more countries. Omar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perron, for 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
On to Mr. Perron for 6 minutes. Thank you very much to the chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing. I'm very interested to the issue of reciprocity. There's a very big issue here that is constantly brought up by our local farmers. There are a lot of products that are imported that are not conforming to the standards here. So there are phytosanitary products that are being imported that don't respect the norms here, the standards here, and it just creates a domino effect. I will start with the following question: how do you change this? Do you think that there is a problem currently? Do you think I'm correct in my assessment? And how can we adjust this without increasing the cost of food?
It was a bit more international setting. I will go first, Angela, if you agree. So I would hope that all the imports that are entering Canada are satisfying the SPS requirement, right? That they are minimum standards that have to satisfy, that those are not, imports are not necessarily different in the parameters that they have to satisfy, that they would be dangerous for health or I don't know what. There is a set of standards, SPS standards, which are sanitary and phytosanitary measures that the imports coming to Canada have to satisfy. So I am not sure that there would be a problem. It is possible that there is a perceived problem, that the farmers might perceive that the quality, for example, the environmental standards that are incorporated environment is not part of an SPS measure, but it is possible that the farmers perceive that the environment in which those products are produced is in fact entering to the SPS measure. So this is a discussion on how products are produced, which might or might not impact the quality. That's for a different hearing. And that would require additional discussion in terms of how those standards are actually created.
Madame Bédard?
Ms. Bédard?
Yes, so I would echo much of that in terms of the need for further discussion around making sure those standards are implemented. I know that's a conversation that you've been having around this table in terms of that particular concern. It is also important then, as part of those discussions, that we're discussing what evidence, that it's coming from a place of evidence-based decision making, right? And I think that those, whatever those standards are that are being implemented, are looking at the latest in science, and that we're making those comparisons. I do think that as we continue to improve and enhance our capabilities with respect to digital agriculture, data management, there's going to be more and more tools for that type of accountability and measurement, which can be one of the bigger challenges, I think, that you might be hearing about from some of your producers.
Merci beaucoup. Désolé de vous interrompre.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to cut you off. I just don't have much time left. I agree with all this data, but for example, let's look at the carrot. It's an easy example. When the recipes have been changed, our producers could not. We almost imported products that were not properly certified. Last summer, there were carrots from China that were imported, and they were actually forbidden in the United States because they wanted to protect the soil. I agree with both of you, but we need proper measures. Here's another question. When we talk about certification and reciprocity, is a problem for Canada because we are a smaller market than our trade partners. International organizations will not invest in certifying a product in Canada, but will first invest in Europe or in the United States. The question is for both of you. Do you think it's possible to come up with some sort of international collaboration without reducing the quality requirements, but we can work with multiple partners?
Thank you for the questions. They are international certification bodies, right? They are international standard setting bodies. For example, we have the Codex Alimentarius that sets up the standards for the food products. I am not particularly aware. I will admit I don't follow the Canadian carrot markets to the great detail, so I cannot comment on this particular case. But the standards, they are international standard setting bodies that are of assistance, and I'm
Merci
sure
beaucoup, Madame Totova. Désolé de vous être.
Thank you, Ms. Totova. Sorry to cut you off. Ms. Bédard, in a few seconds.
Yes, I think that some of the issues I'm hearing about here today probably reflect more strongly the issues in terms of how are things being measured and looked at as they come into the country, as opposed to a border carbon adjustment piece. It's the existing framework that needs to be looked at in terms of how those standards are being applied.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perron. Now, Ms. McPherson, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to the witnesses for this testimony today. It's been very interesting for me. I have to admit that I'm not a regular member of this committee, and this is all very new to me. So forgive me if my questions are a little simple, I guess. My first question is actually for Dr. Bedard-Hahn. I was surprised to hear that there hasn't been sufficient research done. You know, we know trade is complex. We know trade relationships are complex. They are in many different settings. But your testimony was a lot about how there wasn't enough research. We didn't have the information. We didn't have the data to make informed decisions. And so I guess my question for you is, why don't we have that data yet? Why has this taken so long? Obviously, carbon pricing has been in place for a long time. And also, is there adequate resources for researchers in Canada by the federal and provincial governments to accomplish this?
Great. That's an excellent question and a suitable interpretation, I think, of my testimony in this context. So if we look at the research landscape across Canada, part of it, we've done a lot of research on different regions, and that's how I can say with a high degree of confidence that there is huge regional variability. So one of my concerns then is if we start to look at something that is potentially then a federal has federal implications, how do we roll that up? So, you know, if I were to say, you know, what are the similarities and differences between potatoes produced in Lethbridge, Alberta versus on Prince Edward Island, or if I look at crop production on the prairies versus southern Ontario, those are some of the challenges that I would say we have. The other challenge that we have just in terms of collecting and bringing all of this data together is just the sheer size of our country, right? So actually capturing some of that variability across space and time, the cost of getting data that we can be very confident in is very high, because in this context, so like compared to other markets or industries where we might be looking at such a thing, where we're looking at a product or an industry where there's maybe a factory, there's walls around it, and yes, there's lots of things flowing in and out, but it's a bit more defined. We have more control over it. There's all these other climate variables that influence, so the carbon cost of a particular commodity in a year might be the carbon intensity will vary. How much drying had to be done on that grain, right? How much, what fertilizer was necessary in a particular year? What other kinds of considerations had to go into that? And so it's that complexity, and it's at a national level, it's very hard to bring all those data sets together if we want to roll this up into a single federal framework.
Well, and when I hear you say that it is costly and that it is complex, I understand that. I just returned from Ireland, and of course their trade relationships are very complex too, because Brexit means that they're part of the European Union, but the UK is not. So there are complexities around the world. Ours is different because of the size and our federated system. But what is there examples where this work is being done, that it is working very, very well, or that they have done the research and have some lessons that we can learn?
With respect to other countries, perhaps in the EU, I would defer to Ms. Titova on that. But I would argue that it would be much more straightforward in a smaller geographic region, because even though you have the complex diversity of the markets or what's being exported, you don't have to layer on that geographic complexity. That means that carbon intensity looks very different for the same commodity in different parts of the country. So, the U.S. would be facing the same issues that we are, as would most likely Australia. If we look across the EU as a whole, it would be different versus, an individual country within the EU.
Ms. Titova, could I ask for your input as well?
Yes, indeed. Also in the EU, let me start by saying that looking at the carbon intensity in this setting is something relatively new. Right? It is not, we have spoken a lot about trade, we have a lot of trade data, but trying to detect the carbon content in specific products, taking into account how those products or commodities, if you wish, if it's easier to think in terms of commodities, how those are produced and which steps should be included, this is a relatively new undertaking. So they are ways to do it. They are methodologies that are being developed. Those methodologies could differ between the countries, but there has been progress. In the EU, for example, if you look at Ireland, which is very different from the condition in Ireland, will be very different from conditions in Italy, for example, right? You are producing different products, so there is the diversification element. There is the question of irrigation. So there are just many factors, but I remain optimistic that there is quite a bit of thinking going along in those along these lines.
It's probably my time.
10 seconds. I don't know if you
You can have
something.
it back.
Yeah,
It's still
thanks.
yours.
Thanks, Ms. McPherson. We'll go back to the Conservatives. Ms. Rood for 6 minutes, please. 5 minutes, please. Sorry.
Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I wanted to ask Ms. Bedard-Hahn, how might the introduction of these CBAMs conflict with Canada's broader efforts to promote agricultural innovation and sustainability, undermining the economic viability of the sector?
That is a fantastic question, and I would say it's one of the big concerns that we have here in Canada. We do tend to be relatively early, very innovative, and relatively early adopters in a lot of technology that drives that is driving agriculture forward. And so the concern is that we develop approaches that are tested and validated through evidence as being more sustainable, less carbon intense. So for example, through crop breeding or other types of novel crop inputs, and that those then in turn are not recognized globally as providing the advantages that they do. And so my concern, that's probably one of the bigger concerns, is that if we let this be driven elsewhere in perhaps less innovative or perhaps more innovation adverse areas, that we would end up undermining our potential. And it's, given the changes that are happening globally and the food security challenges that we have, I think we need to be using everything that's in our toolkit. So yes, that's an important question, and part of why I think Canada needs to take a leadership role in these early discussions, being proactive rather than reactive.
Thank you very much. Just a follow-up. Are you concerned with the university's own innovation research could be disincentivized?
I think that the innovation research will still need to continue, and it will need to be a top priority. It would only become disincentivized insofar as it might limit our toolkit, right? So the hope would be that A, that wouldn't happen, and B, though, that if it did, that that there would be that opportunity for us to pivot and work elsewhere. But universities tend to pursue those paths. That's one of the advantages of university research as opposed to work that's happening solely within an industry context.
Thank you so much. I'm going to cede my time to Mr. Steinley.
Thank you very much. A few quick questions with the time I do have. Ms. Bedard-Hahn, do you know how many soil types there are in Saskatchewan alone, let alone just Canada?
It depends how you define soil type. So I could spend, as a soil scientist, I could spend hours going through that. Very broadly, we have, even within our one dominant soil type that we have, there's a whole lot of variability in that in terms of the soil texture, the amount of organic matter that's associated with it. Each of those would affect how those soils function or behave in terms of carbon intensity.
And as you well know, different soil types also require different fertilizer, and that's why it's very 100%. Hard to 100% compare them. The one question I do have, and the concern I have about some of this, is our producers in Canada and Western Canada specifically are still trying to understand what kind of credit and how we're going to give them the credit for the sequestration part. Everyone talks about the emissions part, but not the sequestration part. I feel that's a big part of this conversation that we're missing. Do you have any comments on how we can give the credit to our producers that they so richly deserve, because he talked about, and I've talked about in committee many times, the innovations, zero-till, crop rotation, all the good things we've done, where our producers just continue to not get credit from this government.
Yeah, and so if we, referring back to the work that looked at the carbon intensity of some of the commodities that we're producing in Saskatchewan, the work done by the Global Institute of Food Security, comparing that to other parts of the world, that work did take into account the sequestration piece. That's part of what gives it such an advantage, and that's where when I'm talking about the importance, for example, of measurement reporting and verification, that's where we need to be accounting for that. The other piece we do need to be talking about is that when we're talking about emissions as part of this, we need to recognize that part of what our producers are doing, even those early adopters, they're avoiding further emissions by continuing to do those practices. Because if they were to revert to the more intensive tillage, for example, we would be right back where we were in the 40s and 50s in terms of large amounts of emissions associated with agriculture that we've managed to avert in the years since.
Quick comment is also we should look at some of the emissions per tonnage too, per what you're producing as well. I think that's a conversation that also needs to be in this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Steinle.
And that's in that GIF study as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And now to Ms. Taylor-Roy for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Ms. Bedard-Han and Ms. Titova for being here. Your testimony was very interesting, very insightful, and it really highlights the complexity of reducing carbon emissions and measuring that, especially in the context of global trade. And I think, my colleague across the way has just talked about, how difficult it is to really get to really estimate the amount of net emissions. But we know hard things are hard, and that's why we have brilliant people like yourselves both looking at this, because it's something we need to do. And I'm wondering that, you mentioned that Canada needs to take a leadership role in this. And do you feel that undertaking a study such as this and starting to look at it now in advance of the imposition of CBAMs by our trading partners is important? And if so, why? Perhaps we can start with you, Ms. Bedard-Han.
Yeah, so as much as I said at the outset that thank goodness we're not there yet, I'm also grateful that we are starting the conversation now for that very reason, so that we can acknowledge that the question that we were asked: what are those three things we need to be looking at now? Because those three things are not things that we can get done by the end of 2024, right? These are big asks, and by making this a priority, a research priority, a government priority, making sure we've got our heads around it, we're going to be a much stronger position to set the stage for others if we end up in this space down the road.
Also comment on that?
Yes, I'm very much in agreement with that. If you look at the CBAM related measures elsewhere, they are looking at really at iron, steel, cement, fertilizers, are very energy intensive sectors. Now, if we look at agriculture, there is not as much discussion. There is some discussion about extending the border adjustment measures to agriculture, and by getting this, let's say, early start to think about it, I think it's really, I would like to compliment indeed the committee that you have embarked on this study at this point.
Thank you very much. And, we talked about the complexity, the administrative burden of measuring and accounting for specific carbon footprints. And we do want to ensure, of course, in any measurement of the kind of net ecosystem as you were talking about, we would be measuring not only the sequestration, but also emissions and any changes. And obviously on a per ton basis, all of that would be part of it. But I'm wondering, even with that, it seems very complex to do it farm by farm and product by product. Has there been any discussion about other ways that we can incentivize farmers to adopt these practices, and also ensure that our farmers that have better sustainable practices are benefiting in the global market without doing it on kind of a product and farm basis? Just briefly, if you can, because I know my time's running out, but are there other ways to do this?
Yeah. So this is the advantage of us starting early. So there are tools that we have. You know, if I were to use the example of soil measurement, we can combine local measurements with machine learning tools, and we're building up our toolkit and our ability to do more of that work without farm by farm measurement. But we need to build up that data set to empower us to use those other tools down the road. So that's part of the innovation space. Yes, there's the innovation in terms of developing new varieties and things like that, but this is the other innovation is actually in the measurement space and how we can combine remote sensing and machine learning technologies with a smaller number of local measurements to move forward in this space.
Fantastic. Tova, do you have anything to
I'm
add?
very much in agreement with that.
Oh, okay. So I'm just also wondering about the concept of the pickles. Actually, I was going to talk about the pickles as well, because we also have to look at ways that we can incentivize the whole chain to be more carbon neutral, including transportation. And I would hope that some of this would actually encourage more food processing manufacturing in Canada because of the emissions component of shipping things out and shipping things back. And if that was actually incorporated in these measurements, we may see more incentives, more investment in Canada for food processing. Do you agree, and how would you see doing that?
Is me nodding vigorously. Yes, absolutely. I agree that's an essential piece. So it needs to be looking at incentivizing value-added processing closer to the source, while also looking at ways to improve our transportation pathways.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Taylor-Roy. Now, Mr. Perron, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci.
Thank you. Ms. Totova, in your introduction, you talked about 25% of GHG emissions from the agricultural sector that need to be reduced. We can both agree on that. But you also talked, I think we should also take into consider the positive impacts of agriculture, for example, maintaining some land, the carbon impact when you do some direct tilling, for example. Ms. Bédard-Han, you talked about recognizing the value of our own practices and measuring it in a sustainable way. I've been pushing for such things for a long time. How do we measure and incentivize people who really struggled for 25 years because they were protecting what they had, and now we're incentivizing someone else who is changing their practices without taking into consideration the pioneers behind these measures? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's certainly an important topic for me, Monsieur Pro. Here in Saskatchewan, we have so many early adopters of practices like conservation tillage, and I spend a lot of my own research time both trying to get an effective quantification of the benefits we've accrued to date from those early adopters, but also I think it's important for us. One of the opportunities that we have before us now is to look at how we can incentivize those individuals to continue doing those important practices in the face of other types of pressures. My greatest concern is that we implement some sort of a policy or a framework that unintentionally disincentivizes those early adopters. For example, by penalizing or by only rewarding the late adopters, because at that point, then that the early adopters are being told, well, the only way you can get this particular carbon credit is to break up, to stop doing conservation tillage, blow off all the carbon that you've already sequestered, and then start over again by reintroducing these practices. So I do think it's important for us to think about how to credit avoidance of emissions that would be so easy to end up in that situation with the wrong policy instrument.
If I may add, it was 28% of the entire agri-food system. But of course, we recognize that agriculture has also positive benefits in terms of lowering the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a matter of the agricultural policies within specific countries on how they balance this demand. And there is no universal prescription, right? A lot depends on how the agricultural policy is set up in the country. So you reward people who have been doing something, the conservation tillage, for example, for a long time, while at the same time you encourage, maybe with a slightly different policy instrument, you encourage the people who have not been doing that, and in fact they should, let's say, convert to this practice.
Thank you very much. Now, finally, Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to start with Dr. Bedard Hahn. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, so the OECD, in 2021 recommended investing in emission abatement technologies to prevent emission leaking, which many witnesses have also echoed at the study. Do you believe that this is a favorable alternative to BCAs? Do you think that both approaches could work together? Could they complement each other? I'd love your thoughts on that, please.
Very briefly, yes. I do think it's important for these, for both of these to work together. If we do go to the BCA, so I think one is probably, with the border carbon adjustments, we are further; those are further into the future due to all of the various complexities that we're looking at. Some of the emission abatement approaches that we're looking at, I think there's those. Some of those are going to be perhaps, depending on the specific one you were talking about, some of those are going to be are more innovation driven and will be relatively easy to adopt in the shorter term. So I think it's a both and as opposed to an either or.
Do you have any comment on that?
I absolutely agree that we need to try everything that is going to work in terms of whether it's abatement, whether it's different policies, so we achieve an improvement.
Dr. Bedard Hahn, one last question for you. There were consultations regarding Canadian BCAs in 2021. Did the University of Saskatchewan know about? Did you participate in these consultations?
I did not.
Did you know about them?
I did not. I was relatively new to my dean role at the time, and so it may not have come to my attention. I can't say for sure whether any of my colleagues may have been engaged in those conversations, though. So
from that, can I assume that from your perspective, that the consultations were insufficient?
I don't know whether they were insufficient. I can say that that when I reached out to my colleagues in agriculture and resource economics on this issue in advance of my of being here today, the only one that I heard back from who was actively engaged in this space was Richard Gray. But there have been a couple of retirements in the last couple of years, so it's possible that institutional memory has been lost.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Thank you to our witnesses. I'm just going to ask one question to Dr. Bedard Hahn. You were mentioning it in the previous questioning about your concerns with implementing a system that may not recognize the achievements of those producers who have adopted, minimal till and crop rotation and precision agriculture, things like that. Has your colleagues done any work or coming up with a preferred system, let's say, that would give recognition to producers for their carbon sequestration in terms of a carbon credit market or something along that line? Has there been any consensus on what would be a preferred model?
I don't think we're fully at consensus yet beyond saying, yes, we need to have something in place. We are actively working on 2 or 3 different possibilities in that space, including, as I mentioned, credit for avoidance as in addition to or complementary under a different tool than sequestration. So I think that's one piece. There have been other conversations about ways to incentivize this, thinking about the soil benefits, the ecosystem benefits that go with some of these practices as well. So are there other opportunities for crediting these folks by looking at their risk of reduction? When we think about agricultural risk, these same practices tend to reduce your risk of soil erosion, soil loss, disease and so on. And so looking at how, are there crop insurance benefits, for example, that could be accrued to some of these folks that go beyond or in addition to any type of a carbon market. The carbon market, we're just really stuck right now with the international requirement for the additionality piece. But I do think that we need to acknowledge this, that these folks, each year that they're continuing to do this practice, they are avoiding a whole lot of carbon loss that would otherwise be occurring. Likewise, precision agriculture, they are avoiding a lot of emissions that might otherwise be occurring. And so we are actively working on ways to quantify that.
So Tatova, an opportunity, maybe internationally, has there been some work on an international standard, let's say, in terms of what are best practices or other countries that have implemented a system that seems to be working?
There have been efforts. I'm not sure whether I would call them at this point a success, right? So there is still quite a bit of room on improving the methodologies, harmonizing the methodologies. And it goes back to how I started my testimony that an issue like this, which is a truly global issue, does require a global response.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Your testimony is much appreciated. Colleagues, we're going to suspend for a couple of minutes just to allow our witnesses to move on with their day, and then we'll come back and we'll get some committee work done. So we're just going to suspend for a couple of minutes.
Great. Thank you.
you.